Hello everyone, welcome to this edition of Tudor Talk with me, Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide. Now you will have seen that today's guest is Ann Lloyd, and I'm going to bring Ann on stage in a moment after I've done a little introduction, and we're going to be talking really about courtship and Elizabeth I. Very, very apt, of course, as this video is going out on Valentine's Day. No coincidence. See, I planned something. Hey. So I hope you're well. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be going for no more than an hour today. So that's roughly what you can expect from today. I've got some questions I'm going to be putting to Ann, so I hope you enjoy our chat. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest. So of course, many of you will know Ann Lloyd, historian, author and a speaker, and she specialises in early modern history with a particular focus on the Tudors and Shakespeare. Now, she's presented programmes for institutions such as the Smithsonian Associates, Royal Oak Foundation and the Folger Shakespeare Library. Ann holds degrees in literature and education and hosts the popular podcast British History, Royals, Rebels and Romantics, so perfect for today. And her publications include The Tudors by Numbers, and of course Ann was a guest here talking about that some time ago, and also the recently released Courting the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I and Her Suitors. And that, my friends, of course, is our subject for today's chat. So let me bring Ann onto the stage. Hello.
Hi, it's so good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us again. It's been a few months, but it's great to be here talking to you about your next, most current book.
Yes.
Now, you were just telling me it's very snowy where you are at the moment, so it's fun and games over. You're obviously on the East Coast, aren't you, of the US?
On the East Coast, just a few minutes out of Washington, D.C., and we had a surprising snowstorm. So It's cold and snowy here.
I don't know what I prefer, the kind of dark grey, muggy, wet that we've got going on out of the window, or a lovely scene of 8 inches of snow. I'm not sure really, but I think, as you said before we came on, nice if you don't have to go anywhere. A bit more of a problem if you've got to travel, but Right. Anyway, let's crack on. I'm sure folks are fascinated to hear about our chit-chat, but I'm sure they will be more fascinated to hear about our conversation about Elizabeth. So I do have some questions that I want to talk to you about, and we'll see how many of those we get through in our kind of an hour's time. So let's start at the beginning, which is always, as the song goes, a very good place to start. So Elizabeth I had some early exposure to courtship. It's fair to say she had a fairly traumatic childhood with everything that was going on with her father, and we'll maybe touch a little bit on that in a moment. But I'm interested to know, Carol, how did those early experiences shape her perceptions of marriage and political alliances?
Well, her very first experience, she would not have remembered because it was when she was an infant. And I like to mention that, even though she didn't remember it, because politically, in some ways, it was the least complicated opportunity for marriage she had, because when she was a baby, she was recognized as the legitimate child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn for that short period of time. There was a possibility of an alliance with a French prince, and there were no questions about her legitimacy or her claim to the throne. Of course, before she was 3, her mother was executed, the marriage to Anne Boleyn was annulled, and Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Now, Henry VIII always recognized her as his daughter, but she was in and out of the succession and legally illegitimate from then on. And so every possible marriage from then on was through a different sized lens of illegitimacy. Sometimes it was a big deal. After she became queen, it was less of a big deal, but some people still brought it up. So that first one as a baby was the only one complicated from that perspective. But then, of course, as she grew up, even while her father was still alive, and then during her brother Edward VI's reign, She was possibly seen as the daughter of a king, now the half sister of a king, but still not made legitimate. And so she's not being considered for these big royal marriages into the other royal courts. Often it's because of that. And so it was a really interesting thing that she grew up knowing that was a problem. Still, it
Mm.
didn't stop suitors from coming. And Thomas Seymour, who was not royal, but a noble in England, the uncle of the king, while Edward VI was on the throne, was certainly interested in Elizabeth as a marriage prospect. But she never would have known, was it Elizabeth he was interested in, or was it access to Edward through Elizabeth? And I think early on, she's very precocious, she's very strategic, and I think she realized that it wasn't just herself, but her proximity to power that was always at the heart, even from early on, of these potential marriage relationships.
Yeah, and how do you think that affected her? I mean, it's guesswork, we don't know, but how do you think that might have affected her emotionally in terms of the way she kept suitors at arm's length or not?
I think it does. I think she realizes it's not always about what she feels or maybe what she wants, but she has to always know that there are political implications to all these decisions she's making. And in the case of Thomas Seymour, had she gone ahead and had the permission of the king not been very clearly granted, the permission of the council not been very clearly granted, she could have been charged with terrible crimes, and she was interrogated about it.
Yeah.
So she was always aware that her relationships existed on many levels, and the political was often the most powerful level of all of those levels, not the personal. Her personal desires were not the leading factor in these relationships.
And of course, we're going to come on to Robert Dudley, who I think, it's that's the most fascinating relationship, because it's almost like, she let him in and then
Mhm.
suddenly she kind of had to withdraw. I think that dynamic of what happens really
Yes,
fascinating. Anyway, we will come on and talk about that. But
yes.
still staying when Elizabeth was just a youngster, of course, she witnessed all the shenanigans around Henry and his marriages and stepmothers coming and going, and
Right.
some in very bloody and dramatic ways, not least to say her own mother. So, how do you think that affected her decision ultimately to remain unmarried?
Well, as you mentioned Robert Dudley, I'll say that according to him, when Elizabeth was 8 years old, she said to him, "I will never marry." Now, 8-year-olds say all kinds of things.
Mm.
In Elizabeth's case, it turned out to be true, and he was looking back through the years and saying, "Oh, well, I've really known because she told me when she was 8." Might have been an excuse for her not marrying him over all these years. But in any case, if we take that, and we don't know if it's true, but if we take that at face value, let's imagine when she was 8, she said she would never marry. What happened when she was 8? Catherine Howard was executed. Now, by the time she was 8, someone will have told her about her mother, and we know that she was close to people who knew her mother. There were people in her household who had known her mother, so she would have learned what really happened to Anne Boleyn.
Mm.
Catherine Howard was a first cousin of Anne Boleyn, so she wasn't just a stepmother to Elizabeth, she was also a blood relation. She had seen when she was 6, 7-ish, Anne of Cleves set aside so the king could marry. Elizabeth's attending these marriages. So she went to the marriage of Anne of Cleves. She saw that set aside. She went to the marriage. I mean, so she sees this.
Mm.
When she's 8, Catherine Howard is beheaded by her husband. Now, we don't want to do a retrospective psychoanalysis or anything, but it's hard to imagine that doesn't affect you
Sure.
as a child.
Yeah. It has to have had, and it's really clever of you to make the link as to what's happening around her at the time. And I think eight's an incredibly impressionable age
Yes.
for loss, and I can imagine it would have had a really, for somebody smart as Elizabeth and
Yes.
perceptive as her as well.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
can imagine it had a massive impact on her. So maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but we know that as Elizabeth came into her own right as a woman, she definitely used courtship as a political tool. But how did she go about then balancing her personal desires with political necessities, as particularly as she grew up and her status changed considerably?
Yes. So we have a really interesting example during her sister Mary's reign, and Elizabeth is growing up now, and she's in her 20s, her early 20s, while her half sister is on the throne. And there's a situation where then Prince Eric of Sweden, addresses her directly, sends his representative right to her to ask for her hand. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to happen. That's supposed to go through the queen and the court and the privy council before it ever gets to Elizabeth. And I think it's just an example of her political savvy right from the start, that she does not even entertain the proposal or the idea. She immediately sends that messenger to her sister and to court. So she's not even going to take any personal stand at all
Mm,
until it goes through the political channels. And I
mm,
just think that's an early example. Before she's queen, she's letting the political structure sort of buffer any perhaps personal desires. I don't think she had any desire to marry Eric of Sweden, but it wouldn't have mattered. She knew how important the politics were.
yeah.
And we see that when she first becomes queen, and interestingly enough, one of her very first suitors is the former husband of her half sister Mary. So, Philip of Spain, who represents Spanish interests, who has brought England into a war with France, very unpopular in England. But Mary is supporting Philip, and so English soldiers and English funds are being used for this war in France. Um, he represents Catholicism. He was sort of Mary's head. Mary designated him to bring England back to Catholicism. So all these things that Elizabeth would not have wanted anything to do with. And yet, when he makes a formal offer of marriage to her, she can't just respond by saying, "Are you crazy? Get out of here." Absolutely not. Any of those things. She has to keep that in place. She has to something that we sometimes call answers answerless, where she's talking and you think she said something, but then after you leave the room, you realize she hasn't answered your question at all. And she can't infuriate Spain while she's also at war with France. I mean, she has to be very pragmatic in waiting to see things resolved with France, and it looks like things are going to be fine with Spain. She doesn't want to offend them, and then eventually turns Philip down, sort of takes the responsibility. I can't marry you because you see me as a heretic, and I'm not going to change my religion. And, it has to be done so carefully so as not to ever offend anybody.
Mm, yeah. It's amazing. I think they call it the art of rhetoric, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
She really was a mistress of it, wasn't she? It was,
Yes, and it's so interesting because during her childhood, when she was not very often at court, she was studying. She had marvelous tutors and threw herself into her studies during Edward's reign, during Mary's reign. She was devoted, and her tutors were very complimentary about her understanding of rhetoric and the use of language, and
mm,
it served her throughout her childhood and then throughout her reign.
it really
So
did. Not a minute wasted on from her point of view. She
yeah.
really, really hugely benefited being able to do that. Now we're going to move on to Robert Dudley. I really like Robert Dudley. I think he's fascinating, even though I know some people don't have much time for him. But before I ask you the question, maybe you could just remind us, who he was, and how did Elizabeth first meet him?
So the Dudley family, and Dr. Joanne Paul has a marvelous book about the Dudleys. They are always just on the fringe, just right next to power. And because they rise so high, they have had many colossal falls before we get to Robert. So Robert Dudley is the son of John Dudley, who was, along with Edward VI, the instigator of the effort to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary and Elizabeth. So both Mary and Elizabeth were specifically disinherited by Edward to bring Lady Jane Grey into the picture and place her on the throne.
Mm.
John Dudley, when Mary took the throne, was, of course, found guilty of treason. His whole family was put in the Tower, and John Dudley, Robert Dudley's father, was executed for treason. Now, during that attempt, Robert Dudley was part of it. He was helping his father. He was tasked with capturing Mary while she was evading being captured. So if they had managed to capture Mary in the effort to put Jane Grey on the throne, it probably would have succeeded, because the way Mary fought back was by raising up all these supporters. Because she was in the countryside, she went to her lands where she had so much support. So Robert Dudley failed to capture her. Did he do it on purpose? We don't know, but he was part of that attempt to disinherit Mary and Elizabeth. So they've known each other for a long time, but he was in the effort to bar her from the throne. I would love to hear their discussion about that. But they had probably met either during the final years of Henry VIII's reign, when he says she told him about never marrying, or certainly during Edward VI's reign. She was not permanently at court, but she would visit court because of his father's position. Robert Dudley would have been at court. So they met before Elizabeth came to the throne. And they were, during Mary's reign, they were both in the Tower of London, held on suspicion of treason at the same time. I personally don't believe they would have been allowed to meet, because if you have people who have been accused of treason, you don't want them getting together and plotting. So I don't think, I mean, we have these romantic fictional accounts of them meeting and their love growing over that time. So I don't think they met, but it was a shared experience, because not everybody goes to the Tower, and very few people come out of the Tower. And so that was a shared experience, because they both could have been executed.
And and of course they saw one of their parents executed for treason.
Yes.
So another shared experience. I mean, you can't, that kind of trauma forges a deep connection. So Amy Robsart, or Rosart, she was, of course, married to Robert, and at some stage she was found dead at the foot of her stairs, and there were all sorts of rumours and scandal surrounding that. Maybe you could just enlighten those people who may not be familiar with that particular episode and why it created so much scandal at the time, and then subsequently, because by this time I think it would be fair to say that Robert and Elizabeth were close. How did it influence that relationship at the time? Where were they in their relationship when Amy died, and what happened as a result of that?
So Amy and Robert were married early on, and it is described early on as a good match, but also a love match. They knew each other. It wasn't a totally arranged marriage. When Elizabeth got out of the Tower and Mary's reign was coming to an end, Robert Dudley was also out of the Tower. He had also been released. He had actually been fighting for Mary in that war against Spain. So Mary had let him out, and there was an accepting that he was back on side and he was fine. But in the final months of Mary's reign, as her illness became clear, many people were sort of going to Hatfield, where Elizabeth was, and Robert Dudley was certainly one of them. So he was at Hatfield with Elizabeth. He was spending a lot of time with her. Their friendship was becoming close. At the same time, he was married. When Elizabeth becomes queen, she makes him master of the horse, which may not sound like a great high-ranking position, but what it means is that he is the person at court who has legal permission to touch the queen when he helps her on and off the horse several times a day. And she loved to ride. She loved to hunt. she was very physically active. So she went riding a lot. And as master of the horse, he went with her. So they spent a lot of time together. Their friendship continued to grow, and rumors were certainly by this time spreading. She was spending so much time with him. He had apartments at court that were near to hers. He was spending time in her chambers, all the while he's married to Amy Robsart. Elizabeth preferred that the courtiers she had, the male courtiers who were married, did not bring their wives to court. She wanted their attention all on her. And there were a few exceptions, but Robert was not one of them. So Amy was not at court. She was in the countryside. And then she was found dead at the bottom of the staircase. Now, there were all kinds of problems associated with that. She had sent all her servants away. There was a fair in town. She sent everyone to the fair. It's very unusual for a noblewoman to be alone ever, and to send everybody away was very surprising. There were rumors she was sick. Perhaps that's what made her fall, but it wasn't a very long staircase. Would she really have broken her neck if she fell down the stairs? There were all kinds of questions. And of course, immediately the focus was on Robert Dudley, who at the time of the accident was at court with Elizabeth. But rumors were rampant. There were investigations, interrogations of all of her servants and everybody around. And the coroner found that it was an accident, that she fell down the stairs by accident, that there was no hanky-panky involved. That did not quell the rumors. And some people believe that from that point on, Elizabeth knew she could be close to him, he could be her BFF, but she could not marry somebody because of the scandal. That does not seem to be how Robert Dudley felt, because he continued to propose to her regularly over the next many years. Probably about 15 years. 75 was his last big one. But she seems to have recognized at that point that the scandal of that meant she could not. And the scandal was throughout Europe. Mary Queen of Scots is supposed to have said that the Queen is going to marry her horse master who has killed his wife to make room for her. So you even have Mary Queen of Scots weighing in. So the scandals are throughout. Not good.
I suppose I've got to ask you the question, though. If she'd have died, genuinely died of natural causes, and there were no rumours, do you think Elizabeth would have married him?
See, it's an ongoing debate, right? Marrying Robert Dudley would have been personally, I think, great for Elizabeth, because she was close to him. And we know that relationship is one of her longest relationships. It lasted right up until his death, from perhaps the time she was 8. He was very loyal to her. However, marrying someone who was a subject, who was not from the highest noble family, would have upended politics in the English court. It would have made someone, I mean, imagine you're the Duke of Norfolk and you're the Duke of the land, and suddenly this Robert Dudley, who was not Earl of Leicester yet, is your king. So it really would have upended English court politics. And I'm not sure that's a chance she would have taken. She knew her claim to the throne was tenuous. She knew there were Catholics who did not believe she should be on the throne, who never accepted the marriage between Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Much of Europe didn't accept the marriage between Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. She was up against it to keep her throne, and I'm not sure she would have taken that kind of political chance to satisfy her personal desires.
I think she was, for me, I think she was too smart to do that. I think if she'd been anybody other than the Queen of England, she probably would have married him. But I just think she was too smart to let her heart get in the way of her head, having seen so much political manoeuvring and its consequences over the course of her lifetime. So yeah, always a great question to debate, though. But since we've just been talking about sort of marriage proposals at home, but of course she's infamous for courting foreign nobles and
Mhm,
all the comings and goings, for example, the Duke of Anjou. Um,
mhm.
so, I suppose we're into the nitty question of, were they ever really serious? And if they weren't, what were the underlying political motives? What was the game that Elizabeth was trying to play?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is to see. So remember Prince Eric of Sweden. After she becomes queen, he becomes King Eric of Sweden. And what he had going for him was that he was Protestant. And I use that term knowing it doesn't mean the same thing at all today that it meant then, but it's
Mm,
just sort of a shorthand for part of this reformed religion. Um, Most of the European royal families were Catholic. And so Eric of Sweden sort of stood out as a Protestant king. So he makes quite a confident, let's just say, offer because he believes he's her only real choice. However, he does tick that religion box, but he doesn't. Sweden's not a strong or a wealthy country who could give England sort of political backup or military backup in the case of a problem. And so, although he ticks the religious box, he doesn't tick the other boxes. And so she keeps that in play a little bit, but one of the things she regularly says in these foreign relationships is she's very aware of what happened with her father and Anne of Cleves when the marriage was arranged and they had not met. So she was not willing to agree to marry anybody that she had not met. Now, this effectively was a barrier that no one really wanted to cross. I mean, no one wants to come to England to be on spec to see if he fills if he satisfies
yeah,
the queen or whatever, because it's humiliating if you get sent away.
yeah.
So this she felt like was a really safe thing to say. Well, Eric of Sweden took her up on it and said, "I'm coming. So plan to see me." And she had to write to him and say, "Do not come." Because she was aware of politically what a disaster it would be for him to come to her and her to send him away. She did not want to humiliate him. She did not want to cause those bad feelings. She had to stop him from coming. So that was just an interesting time where she had to sort of put the brakes
Mm.
on when he overcame her
Yeah, he called her
objection.
bluff, didn't he, really?
Yes, he called her bluff, and that was a bit funny. But I don't think that was ever really in play. I think perhaps Charles of Austria, there were sort of two separate courtships of Charles of Austria, and the second really came about after Mary, Queen of Scots. Well, she'd been Queen of France. She was married to the Dauphin, became Queen of France. Sadly, the King of France, Francois, her husband, died. She went back to Scotland. She married Lord Darnley. They had a son. Then he was killed when Kirklefield blew up, and she's thrown out of Scotland. I mean, she's imprisoned in Scotland. She escapes, comes to England in 1568, when Mary appears in England and begins an increasingly tightly controlled stay in England, Mary, a Catholic queen and a Catholic alternative to Elizabeth, becomes a real threat. And I believe at that point, when negotiations reopen with Charles of Austria, there's a chance that Elizabeth is thinking, I'm going to have to do it this time
Right.
because I need some help here. The problem, of course, one of the problems is Charles of Austria is also Catholic.
Mm.
So is it really helpful to align yourself with a Catholic to help you maintain the throne as a Protestant? So this is kind of one of those ongoing politically, however, that marriage did make some sense.
I could just see how the likes of Cecil would have warmed to that proposition. She
Yes.
must have been
Yes.
like, oh my goodness, no. Anyway, Okay, right. Okay. Now let's get on to one of the biggest debates surrounding Elizabeth, and that's the Virgin Queen. That Elizabeth's virginity, was she or wasn't she? Was that a myth that she created? Do we think she ever hit the sack with Robert Dudley? Because it's got to be with Robert if anybody hasn't it. I don't think
I would.
anybody else got that close to her. What do you think?
So I think, first of all, we don't know for sure. So I think we sort of have to accept that we can look at all the reasons we would say yay or nay, but ultimately it's a secret. However, I believe that, as you said earlier, what she had seen throughout her childhood happening when men get involved, what she had seen happen with her sister when men get involved with a queen, and the fact that she knew, just like Cecil and Walsingham were filling the foreign courts with English spies, she knew her court was full of spies who were reporting to the Pope, who were reporting to Philip of Spain, who were reporting to the Holy Roman Emperor. She
Mm,
knew her court was also full of spies. I see sort of fictional representations where Elizabeth is one in particular. It was anonymous. It was about Shakespeare specifically, but Elizabeth was in, and she would keep getting pregnant, and they would say, "Oh, just send her off on progress like we did last time." As if 2,000 people didn't go with her on the court went with her on progress. She was never alone.
mm,
So she would have had to go to such lengths and take so many chances,
mm,
including the possibility of getting pregnant, because there
mm,
was no chance
mm.
of being sent off on progress. So there would have been really, I don't think, any way of hiding it. Of course, she was. There were all kinds of rumors that she was sleeping with Robert Dudley. There were all kinds of rumors that she had an illegitimate child. Illegitimate, I'm saying, because she didn't marry or acknowledge, but a child with Dudley or with other people. There were rumors that she was having all kinds of relationship. Christopher Hatton, another courtier, there was a rumor she was sleeping with him. I mean, there were all kinds of rumors about her sexual depravity. But think about it. That is what took out her mother.
Yeah.
So if you are trying to weaken her, call into question her right to be on the throne, enrage people enough to rise up against her, for a woman, sexual virtue is the target that is almost always chosen.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that's what all the rumors were about. So I believe she was. I don't think she would have taken the chance, even with Robert. Now, I'm not saying they didn't spend a lot of time together and they
Yeah, there were other things that they
enjoyed
might go up
some
to.
things, but I don't
Yeah.
think she would have risked a
Yeah.
pregnancy or people finding out.
Yeah, it does fit with her character of being the smart kind of head over heart. I really see, she's a head over heart woman, and I admire her for that. It just fits with that whole narrative, I think, about her.
And the way
And
she saw her mother and what happened to her mother's
yeah,
reputation, and Mary Queen of Scots, ultimately, the question about Darnley being killed and Mary
yes,
marrying Bothwell and all of that, which was an attack on Mary's morality with Bothwell,
yeah,
really brought Mary down as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So she's seeing that play out right in front of her.
yeah, yeah. No, lots of really good points there. Um, Okay, so of course she refused to marry, therefore no heir, which had an enormous impact, of course, on the Tudor dynasty. In fact, bringing it ultimately to an end upon her death. How do you think she that must have been a thing to grapple with, really, in her mind, particularly after everything her father went through to secure the dynasty, I'm sure he hoped, for centuries to come, for generations to come. So, first of all, how do you think she squared that in her own mind? And how did she manage that, of course, with the Parliament and the Council and the country?
Well, it is really interesting because no one was more desperate than Henry VIII, who went to so many lengths and went through so many wives to secure a male heir and dynasty. And it's interesting if you look at not just Henry, Mary also married very quickly and convinced herself she was pregnant at one point. It was probably a phantom pregnancy, but desperately wanted to have a child. And so it was front and center. With both of them, Edward was very young, so we don't know that. Of course, Henry VII also very focused on having an heir and a spare and children. So it had been a family tradition, and it is one of the most important roles of any monarch to continue the family dynasty. Elizabeth was the last child of Henry VIII. She didn't have a younger sibling who could step in and take the throne, so she knew she was it. It's hard to understand how she squared that herself. Was it the pragmatic, I can keep England safe now while I'm the queen by not marrying, and then God will take care of them afterwards? They're on their own afterwards. It's hard to say where she came
Mhm.
down on that. We do have some statements that she made to Parliament. Now, these were, of course, public. They were for public consumption. She knew they would be recorded. She knew they would be reread. So they're public statements, not private, where she tells Parliament, and there is an ongoing debate between Elizabeth and Parliament, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, from her very first Parliament about her marriage and her begetting an heir. And she was encouraged right from the start to get married. It was assumed she would get married. Let's get you going, let's get you married, kind of thing. Very not that casual, but that direct. And as the years went on, Parliament got more and more and more direct, and she got angrier and
Mhm.
angrier about it. She would make statements like, God will provide. If God tells me to get married, I will marry the person God tells me to marry. And when they asked her to at least name an heir, and okay, until you get married, will you name an heir? Most of the time it was no, God will provide an heir. So she fell back on that. With some people would say that's very irresponsible. I mean, if you're the monarch, that's your job. So, step up. I believe that she was ambivalent at best about having a child. She did make some comments about how can I love my winding sheet. In other words, her child would represent her death. This child becomes monarch when you die. So
Mm,
every time you see that child, that's your successor. How could
mm,
I love the person who's going to be my successor?
mm,
She had also seen in the case of the throne passing from her sister to her, as Mary got ill, olive court is now coming to Elizabeth. And she said something about people tend to look at the rising rather than the setting sun. She was afraid she would lose the focus and people's affection and people's support. And interestingly, again, as a man, as a male monarch, Henry VIII's reign is strengthened by having a son. Henry VII's reign was strengthened by having a son. Mary, Queen of Scots, lost her throne to her 1-year-old child.
yeah, I was just thinking that. I mean,
Yeah. He was a better choice than an adult woman with experience. Now,
yeah,
there were other reasons, but ultimately, as a female monarch, Elizabeth's had she had a son, that would have represented a real challenge. It
yeah,
didn't give her the strength that a son gave, say, Henry VIII.
yeah. Mm,
And there's a letter from Cecil, who was a great supporter of Elizabeth. Excuse me. In this letter, he says, God send our mistress a husband, and by him a son, for the good of the realm and our future. And that uber focus on a son. It's not Elizabeth that's providing us peace in the future. if she has a son. And I think she decided that's not what she was going to do. She was not going to give herself a rival. She was fighting off other rivals. She was not going to provide one for herself,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which
It makes
may
a
not
lot.
have been
Go
the
on.
best thing.
Yeah, it makes consummate sense, and who can blame her? Who can blame her? Everything that she's witnessed, and as you say, then not just as a child, but then she sees Mary Queen of Scots forced to abdicate. So yeah, I can't blame her at all. I also think there's a little bit of vanity in there because she did like to be the centre.
Yes.
She really did like to be the centre of attention. So it feels to me like it's a combination of fear, not unreasonably so, self-preservation, and a bit of vanity thrown in as well.
Absolutely. And I think that goes with the marriage too. She is famously supposed to have said to Robert Dudley, I will have but one mistress here and no master. And
Yeah,
I
I got
think
that
that
quite.
I'm in charge and look at
Uh,
me.
yeah, yeah, don't forget it. Well, that brings us on actually to a slightly different focus, but quite a nice link there because obviously Elizabeth created this image for herself. You know, and she was adored as the centre of the court. So I suppose the question is, how did Elizabeth's courtships influence kind of the cultural and artistic expressions of the time?
So one of the ways, and we do see this flowering during Elizabeth's reign and actually throughout the Tudor reign, particularly after the break with Rome, of portraiture. And so we see um, the coming of different types of portraiture. We see Elizabeth being portrayed in particular ways. So we are used to sort of the big portraits. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery, right? The Ditchley portrait, which is larger than life of Elizabeth. And that's a great example. She's being shown standing on the world with her feet in certain places. And this glorious virgin queen wearing all these ropes of pearls. And so the establishment of herself as an icon, as a virgin icon that you could almost worship. Now that the nation's not Catholic anymore, we have sort of removed the Virgin Mary and we are giving you the Virgin Queen. And so iconography is part of that. But in addition to these large portraits, rainbow portraits, another one that's just so beautiful, there are miniatures. So people can carry portraits of the queen with them. Now we see this through the Tudors, but we see sort of a flowering of it with Elizabeth, painted for so many different ways, so many different people, and the use politically of that kind of portraiture. We also see with Elizabeth, and I do think there's a sense where I'm doing some research right now on Shakespeare and some of the plays. We think of Shakespeare as not being a particularly pro-female. I mean, men have this many more lines and men have this many more parts and all of that. Very true. But if you look at the women and particularly the marriages in Shakespeare's plays, the women are often choosing their husbands, which was not true at the time. But in the
Mm.
plays, Juliet's deciding who she wants to marry. Beatrice in Much Ado is saying, I don't want to marry, I don't want to marry. Well, okay, maybe him. You see over and over the women in Midsummer Night's Dream, these women are choosing their husbands. These women are saying no to their fathers. And I think part of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, as turning down, Shakespeare's writing in the 1590s and beyond. And so he is writing at the end of those decisions, but promoting that idea of women choosing their husbands or women choosing not to marry, at least for a while. I think it sort of bleeds out or goes out into some of that. And you have this wonderful language in the plays where a woman is saying, as it please me, when she's talking about a courtship or about a marriage. And Elizabeth has used similar language. So I think we see it in the portraits, but I think we also see it in some of the literature.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to just see this notion of a woman being in control of courtship and marriage in a different way over these years. I mean, Mary chose her husband, but this goes on over these years.
Mm,
This happens for
mm.
Elizabeth, and it happens for the playwrights of her time.
Yeah, lovely. That's interesting. Interesting. It didn't though trickle down into society in general, did it? I mean, I think
No,
no,
no.
not at all. It was really, it was her
No, and
initiative.
actually, Elizabeth herself saw herself as an exceptional woman. She
Yeah.
did not believe that women in general should be in charge.
Mm,
She saw herself as sort of a woman out of her time
mm.
kind of thing. So she was not advocating for increased rights for women or increased
Yeah, she
recognition
wasn't
of
a
women.
feminist of her age.
She was not,
No.
other than for herself. And
Yeah,
so I think she would have enjoyed watching these plays, but I don't think she necessarily thought off stage women should have been choosing their own
yeah,
spouses, although
yeah,
she might have enjoyed watching it.
yeah. Okay, so are there any instances where Elizabeth's courtship sort of shenanigans backfired on her, or led to any unintended consequences?
Well, the time when Eric of Sweden almost came over was a little bit of
Yes,
that.
of course.
But the other thing that it didn't quite but could have is the notion of religion and what would be acceptable to Elizabeth, because as I mentioned, other than Eric of Sweden, almost everyone else who was considered, especially from other countries, which is where it really, these shenanigans really had the potential to blow up a little bit if it went wrong. It was really interesting how far she said she would go on religion. So, Charles of Austria, for example, he was not going to become a member of the Church of England. I mean, that full stop. However, if he attended services with Elizabeth and he practiced Mass privately, away from prying eyes, would that be acceptable? And initially, Elizabeth thought, well, he'll never do that. Yeah, 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 that'd be acceptable. And then his ministers came back and said, okay, I think we have a plan here, because he will say, and then she was saying, oh, no, he can't actually attend services in private. So there was some back and forth. Religion tended to be a sticking point, even though I think Elizabeth's approach to religion was still pretty pragmatic. She was not looking to make the push into reform that Edward made. She was not wanting to go back to Catholicism like Mary. I think both Mary and Edward were faith driven and really fervent
Mm,
driven. I think Elizabeth was more pragmatic, sort of like her father.
mm,
Keep things settled, keep people as happy as possible, but mainly not rebelling. But with some of these foreign interactions, the idea that a husband could come in, be king of England, and be breaking a law about religion, she realized that couldn't hold. That could not be kept secret. That
mm,
would get out and undermine some of what she was doing.
mm.
And so those kind of back and forth negotiations, if they'd hit at the right time or if someone else had read it, you could see where that could have gotten pretty sticky for her.
Yeah, gosh, she had such a complex set of factors to navigate, didn't she? And she did it really
Yes.
with a tremendous aplomb. Um, but we're actually just coming up to, we're actually on 10 to, so we've just
Oh
got
my
10
goodness.
minutes. I
This is
know,
what's so fun.
time always flies. So I'm going to squeeze one more question in before we just sort of round up and find out where we can find out what you're up to and where we follow you, etc. And that's the kind of the hypothetical question. If Elizabeth had chosen to marry, how might it have altered the course of English history? What do you think, Carolyn?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think we can look at different ways. If she had chosen to marry one of her international suitors, so for example, perhaps she went ahead and married Charles of Austria because there was so much danger from Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catholicism. but he had brought all of this Catholicism into England and the support of Catholic Europe. It's possible that England would have leaned back into Catholicism. And if you can imagine, rather than the Stuarts on the throne, a Catholic brought up child of Elizabeth on the throne, that would have put England on a very different path. On the other hand, if she had married an English, perhaps Dudley, okay, if she'd gone ahead and married Dudley and they had had a son, think of the political implications when Elizabeth died and the child of someone whose claim to the throne was suspect. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate, and the other parent was not royal in any way and was seen as an ambitious, power-grabbing usurper of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
The political chaos, I mean, we're not that far out of the Wars of the Roses when there were
Yeah,
questions who
right.
deserved to be the monarch. And so that really could have plunged the country. There were more royal, with associations with royal descent, that could have really made a play for the throne. And we still would have had the Stuarts. I mean, James wouldn't have immediately become the heir, but certainly the Stuarts would have still had their heir, Bella Stuart. There were other people with closer claims to the throne. So, marrying outside of England, marrying inside of England, all of that could have sent things in a different direction. And the final marriage possibility, the Duke of Anjou, I want to be sure we mention him because he was very important. He was the only one that she did allow to come from a foreign country, from France, to court her in person. In fact, he came twice. He was much younger than she was. And realistically, one of the questions her counsel had was not that it's not possible today, but in those days, for her to have had a child in her 40s into her 50s was very unlikely at that
Mm,
time.
mm,
So, marriage to the Duke of Anjou would likely not have produced a child, or if she had become pregnant, her chances of surviving a pregnancy, again, not the same as today, but in her day
mm,
would have been very low. So
yeah.
there's a possibility of a child without Elizabeth, and the child as an infant becomes the monarch. That's always problematic. If there's no child, what happens with a marriage to France in a time where France is Catholic? That half the council was opposed to the marriage because of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where all these Huguenots in France had been massacred, as the saying
Mm,
goes, because of their religion. So you've now married somebody from that royal family. Would that have caused uprisings in England? So there are just all kinds of things that could have been different and could have destabilized the country.
mm, yeah.
So even though there was no heir, it was a peaceful transition to James. Now, the Stuarts were not entirely successful, especially the male Stuarts. Actually, Mary and Anne were more successful as monarchs, but Charles the First and James the Second, both in different ways, but pushed off the throne. So the Stuarts aren't completely successful. But that transition from Elizabeth to James was peaceful. It was fairly automatic. It was not disputed. So she accomplished that
Yeah.
without marrying, maybe more successfully than
Yeah.
had she married.
Yeah, it's a really interesting final thought, actually. Really interesting. Thank you so much for that. Oh, gosh, I can't believe, as I said, I can never believe how quickly the time goes when we're having these conversations. It flies by. But yeah, so a couple of questions about you then, Caroline. What are you doing at the moment? What can people expect from you next?
Well, I am working on some Shakespeare stuff I find really exciting, and I'm having some questions and some requests for programs on Shakespeare and leadership. So I'm doing some really fun things with that because I've come to think of Shakespeare
Hello. Hello.
So I'm doing a lot of that, and I have another project underway. I'll mention that it has a bit to do with courtly love and how queen consorts before Elizabeth, who was not a queen consort, but in times before Elizabeth, managed some of their power through courtly love. So
Okay.
those are some of the things I have going on.
Okay. There was a bit of a break in the reception there for a moment, so we lost a little bit of that. You were talking about Shakespeare and leadership.
Oh, yes.
And was there something else in between?
Just that I'm doing some new programs about Shakespeare and leadership. They're going to be on my YouTube channel, so you can look for those in the days and weeks ahead. Sorry about
Okay,
that.
great. So that brings us on to where can people follow you and find you?
Okay, so my hashtag on all kinds of social media is at @ShakeUpHistory. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Carol Ann Lloyd, Shake Up History on Facebook and LinkedIn, and then my YouTube channel, Carol Ann Lloyd, Shake Up History. And as you mentioned, the podcast is Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.
Fantastic. So lots out there for you to get your teeth into, folks. Make sure you pop along and follow Carol Ann on your favorite medium. I know some people love the podcast, some people love the video, some people love the writing. So, okay, well, yeah, we're just coming up to the hour, so it just remains for me to say a massive thank you. How lovely to have you back, and thank you so much for sharing all of your research and insights and thoughts with us today, Carol Ann.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It is always so fun to chat with you. I feel like we could go on for hours because I can't believe an hour has passed.
I know that's the case. And just a quick thank you to those of you who've tuned in today. I hope you've enjoyed the chat, and just check out my website, the Tudor Travel Guide, to be updated with all the latest blogs. When new chats are coming up or podcasts, you'll find all the information there. And of course, that's where you can subscribe to my mailing list. So that's www.thetudortravelguide.com. And you'll find me, if you're a big social media person, you'll find me mostly on Instagram under the Tudor Travel Guide. Okay, well, that's all. Have a lovely rest of day, Carol Ann. Have a great time, you guys out there, and I'll see you soon. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.